Good morning. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to have a chance to get to the bottom of the crisis in relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And to help us do that, we have with us three top experts who have spent significant amount of time in various parts of the region throughout their careers working on Saudi Arabia and other countries in the US government. And I'll have the pleasure of introducing them in a minute. My name is Bilal Saab. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Defense and Security Program at MEI, and I also teach graduate courses at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. I have one job this morning, which is to invite our three speakers, Bruce Rydell, Joanne Cummings, and Kevin Donegan, to provide us with their assessment of the US-Saudi relationship. Each will spend 10 minutes doing that. Then I'll ask each a question about the way ahead. And with the remaining minutes, I'll be happy to take some questions from the audience, so please make sure you type those in the Q&A function. This is an on-the-record conversation, broadcast live on our website and also on YouTube. Let me very briefly introduce our speakers, and of course, you can find their full bios on our website. Joanne Cummings very recently joined the Defense and Security Program at MEI as a distinguished senior fellow on national security. She retired as a Foreign Service officer from the United States Department of Defense. Most recently, she was political advisor to the Combined Joint Task Force against ISIS from 2018 to 2020. Joanne, welcome to the team. My old boss, very dear friend, Bruce Rydell, is a senior fellow and director of the intelligence project at Brookings, where he also serves as a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy. He retired in 2006 after 30 years of service at CIA. And last but not least, Kevin Donegan, the real but retired maverick from the US Navy, who's also a distinguished senior fellow with the Defense and Security Program at MEI. He was the commander of the Fifth Fleet, NAVCENT, Combined Maritime Forces. So welcome to all three of you. We are incredibly honored and lucky to have you with us this morning. Bruce, why don't we start with you, my friend? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you for that kind introduction. About a week ago, Saudi Arabia, in collusion with Russia, at a meeting of the OPEC Plus in Vienna, announced that they were going to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. This comes at a time when Russia badly needs income in order to fight what is a losing war in the Ukraine. It also comes just a month before the American midterm elections. Elections in America are often influenced by the price of oil at the gasoline station. And this comes just a few months after President Joe Biden reversed his position that he would regard the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, often known as MBS, as a pariah, traveled to the kingdom and met with MBS and famously did a fist bump with him. In very sharp terms, this decision to cut oil production is a personal humiliation for the President of the United States. But it's also part of a pattern of reckless and dangerous behavior by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that we have seen since the January 2015 ascension to the throne of King Salman and his elevation of his favorite son, Mohammed bin Salman, into various positions of importance, starting with the defense minister and culminating in becoming crown prince and most recently prime minister. Let me give you a few examples of those reckless decisions. In March 2015, the Saudis intervened in this ongoing civil war in Yemen. Mohammed bin Salman told then Director of Central Intelligence John Brennan, who was visiting Riyadh, that the war would be over in, quote, a few weeks, and then we will turn our attention north and get rid of the regimes in Iraq and Syria. As Brennan writes in his memoirs, his immediate question to himself, which he didn't offer verbally, was, what is this man smoking? Instead of a few weeks, of course, the war has now gone on for 7 years. It has become an expensive quagmire for the Saudis that's costing them literally billions of dollars. Their arch rival in the region, Iran, supports the Houthis, but that support costs them a pittance. In strategic terms, the war in Yemen is a disaster for the Saudis, and it is the fault entirely of Mohammed bin Salman. Of course, we all remember the October 2018 murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a columnist for the Washington Post, who was brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul after he was deliberately lured there with the assistance of Mohammed bin Salman's younger brother, who had set him up to go there. Less known is the plot to destabilize the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan in March of 2021, a conspiracy involving the former crown prince Hamza, in which the Saudis attempted to destabilize and ultimately overthrow the government of King Abdullah. The Jordanian intelligence service has reams of evidence of the Saudi involvement in this, which it has chosen not to make public because of the importance of Jordanian expatriate workers in Saudi Arabia. But Joe Biden certainly knows all about it. His director of Central Intelligence briefed him as soon as the plot became apparent. Bill Burns, of course, had served as ambassador to Jordan and was there at the crucial moment when Abdullah ascended to the throne. So he's well aware of how serious and dangerous this would be. Just imagine if Jordan, a key linchpin of the region, had been destabilized, the effects that would have had on the Israel and the West Bank, on Iraq, on the civil war in Syria. It was really a remarkable plot. Now, of course, we have this new deal with the Russians. It's already served to have some increase in oil prices, and more is likely to flow from it. Exactly how much oil will come off the market is a subject that oil experts have debated a lot, but it will be a substantial part. It also comes, as I said earlier, after the United States had deliberately asked the Saudis to increase the supply of oil in order to put pressure on, downward pressure on prices. In all of these cases, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is at the center of the decision-making process in Saudi Arabia and has played a very large role in that. The decision-making process in Saudi Arabia traditionally was a consensual agreement of senior princes. That has largely gone away. Decision-making in Saudi Arabia is now increasingly a one-man show, and that one man is Mohammed bin Salman. At the same time, in the last several months, we have seen Saudi Arabia move towards more and more repression at home internally. Saudi Arabia, of course, has never been a democracy. It's never been a human rights virtue, paragon of virtue, but it has become, under MBS, much more of an autocratic police state than it ever was in the past. People can be rounded up and thrown in jail, including people at the highest level of Saudi society, including the former crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, probably the most gifted and talented Saudi of our time, and a man who personally helped to save dozens of Americans from various acts of terror by al-Qaeda. Since he was stripped of being a crown prince, he has been under house arrest at best, imprisonment at worst, and according to some sources, tortured significantly so that it is very difficult for him to even walk. In the last month, we've seen this repression especially directed against women critics of the Crown Prince, who've been given outrageously long sentences for relatively minor infractions, like tweeting posts that are mildly critical of the government. All of this, I think, belies the notion that we have heard from some in the foreign policy establishment that US engagement with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman would somehow move him towards being more moderate, more reasonable to deal with. But we haven't seen that happen at all. And you asked at the beginning, is this the worst we've ever seen in this relationship? Pretty close. I think the worst moment in this relationship was, of course, in 1973, when Saudi Arabia cut off all oil exports to the United States, inducing a recession in the country. It became the priority of the then Nixon administration to get the embargo ended. And that is why we have the famous shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger, first to Cairo and then to Damascus and then back to Cairo. The problem this time, of course, is that the issues are not just policy issue, it's very much a personality issue. And in the case of Joe Biden, it's very personal now. He has been shown to have been a sucker and to have reversed one policy in favor of another and gone off to Jeddah only to be embarrassed just a few weeks later. I'll save my recommendations on what we should do for later, but I do want to make one small footnote here. And that is that MBS's elder statesman and mentor in many ways, the president of the United Arab Emirates and Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, went along with the decision in Vienna and has now gone to Moscow to be filmed sitting with Putin in a really quite interesting endorsement of Putin's policies. The administration should also be taking a relook at its relationship with the Emirates as well as its relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'll finish with this note. This relationship, of course, matters a lot to the United States. It is now over 75 years old, but it matters an awful lot more to the Saudis. We get from this relationship reasonable oil prices. In return, the Saudis get security from enemies at home and abroad. Without American support, that security is going to be very much in danger. And Russia is clearly not going to be able to come to Saudi Arabia's survival. The Russians are losing the war in the Ukraine, and Putin increasingly looks like a man who may soon have a lot more time to spend with his family at home. Let me finish there.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Joanne, you're next.
I apologize for that glitch. Thank you, Bilal. And I'd like to start by giving some honor to the organization that I did retire from, which is the Department of State, not Defense, as close as I am to my colleagues in the Department of Defense. I'm very taken with some of the comments that Bruce made, because it really highlights how complex the relationship is. There are a range of bilateral concerns that we have. We've got, as Bruce mentioned, a 75-year history. And that history has included a number of problematic incidents. We absolutely have had issues with the human rights record in Saudi Arabia. We've had issues with treatment of women, with the actions in Yemen, with a whole range of other factors. However, looking at it from the perspective of a diplomat, if I may, when we're out in the field, we will do deep analysis, make recommendations based on often quite intimate understanding of what the issues are. And yet the policies that may come out from home governments may be quite different, because they have to consider a range of factors that are not entirely about the bilateral relationship. And I'd like to look at that briefly here. I mean, in the bilateral relationship, we have concerns about the role of some Saudis in 9/11. We have deep concern about the role of possibly MBS himself in the brutal killing of Khashoggi. We obviously are concerned about Yemen, and that affects us especially because we have been sort of backdoored implicitly into responsibility for some of those actions. I mentioned human rights. Oil prices are often seen as a bilateral issue. We have, though, in the United States, a very broad range of voices about these things. And sometimes it's for partisan reasons, and sometimes it is because specific issues are of greatest concern. Right now, there are people who are calling for changes in the relationship because of human rights, because of oil prices, because of not standing with the United States against Russia, even though Saudi Arabia did vote to condemn Russia. The voices from Saudi Arabia, at least those within Saudi Arabia or who plan to return, are much more univocal. They are going to make the point that Saudi Arabia has the right to make its own decisions, that this is a purely economic concern and is not designed to do something against the United States. And that sounds plausible, although the personality of MBS has a singular imprint on the way things have been expressed, both how policies have been formulated and also the reaction to comments from the United States. There are factors in the relationship that we have to bear in mind if we are looking at, well, let's make a change. So if we have this frustration and we want to make a change, what does it mean in terms of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, obviously, but also how does it play with friends, with enemies in the region and elsewhere? So, obviously the US has a large presence in Saudi Arabia, and we often think of the military presence, but there's a large commercial presence as well. So we want to consider the impact that changes will have short-term and long-term. We also have, well, both countries have multiple, multilateral, occasionally inconsistent policy priorities that involve other countries. For instance, Saudi Arabia has a history with the United States. MBS may seek to diversify his options. He clearly does not like, even implicitly, being told what to do. It may be that he sees it in his interest to be able to say, well, if you're criticizing me, I can go to other people. What are the implications of that? The issue of this potential change in oil prices will help Russia make more money to fight its war against Ukraine, I think is taking a whole bunch of logical steps that need to be analyzed specifically, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But Russia only makes money producing oil if oil is being bought, and if it is being bought at higher prices. And neither of those appear to be true. So we need to moderate how much we think that's the issue. MBS and Saudi Arabia, and they're not necessarily the same thing because Saudi Arabia has a long history, also thinks about its status in terms of the Gulf, and the Gulf does include Iran. Yemen and the UAE, the relationship with Oman, domestic politics in Saudi Arabia. And as Bruce mentioned, the loss of the moderating force of having the broader consensus. The royal family, for all its faults, did serve to create some constraints on unilateral moves. And that is no longer present. And I think that's worthy of concern. I am most concerned at how a change or even discussion of a change of US policy will affect US relations with other countries, how we are perceived, how we present the very idea of reevaluation, which obviously I'm not opposed to, but the idea of it and the reasons for it will deeply impact how we deal with other countries that are of equal or greater importance. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Kevin, floor is yours.
Hey, Bilal, thanks. And I really appreciate it hearing the views of Bruce and Joanne. Well, first, I thought I'd start with, I'm going to try to put this in the context that some of the speakers have already done, and that is of the U.S. national interests. So it's a view that's near and dear to my heart, and I think it's important when we're looking at making these decisions on going forward. But I also want to say that, and that's both short and long term, right? And we want to make sure we understand short term what's happening, but also look long, because that's what we do in our country, is we're looking at long term stability and long term how are things going to end. But if you go back in history, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot, right? I'll throw the naval component into this, because back 80 years ago, it was King Abdul Aziz and Al Saud who met with FDR on the USS Quincy, right? So that's how far back the relationship goes. 80 decades was already mentioned. And POTUS visits that we're talking about here, and POTUS relationships come and go. They're important, but when they happen, they rarely yield instantaneous results, or the results that you would want right away necessarily. They're always part of a broader approach, and history has a fair share of impact on that. And if you go back and look at the lead up all the way back from when the current president was vice president through the campaign trail to now, you would have relatively low expectations for the presidential visit to Saudi having some kind of instant change on events, right? Because they're much more complex than that. But to be quite frank, we also have these broad national interests related to Saudi Arabia, and I wanted to talk about some of those so that we don't accidentally throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. That we're understanding the full complexity of the issues that we deal with. Politics play a role, no doubt about that here, and the things that Bruce said are spot on when it comes to the president and how he personally feels about this. I think that's obvious. But when it comes to U.S. interests, we do want Saudi business, as Joanne rightly said. We do want them to continue to invest in our businesses. And, with the dollar as strong as it is, it's easy now. Sometimes they could look to Europe and other places to invest their money. We want KSA's support and Saudi Arabia's support in the region relative to our posture on Iran. We'd love to have a united front in that region relative to Iran. We saw the damage and how hard it was when we had the rift with Qatar to have a united front with Iran, and how that impacted our ability to influence. And then without Saudi Arabia as a partner of the United States, we want to look at what that means. What does that mean in terms of security in the region? And what would that, some people talk about Plan B look like without Saudi? Because I think Joanne rightfully said without Saudi also means, and Bruce too said, it's likely without other of our regional Gulf partners, because they're not all the same. They're all individual countries, but there is some alignment on this. We also want to think about it in the context of defense and what it means relative to protecting our own people on the ground in the region and what we need to have there. And so I thought it'd be good to just mention, Bilal, briefly that, a lot of these complex things that I just discussed were actually written about by the White House after the presidential visit and the Jeddah communique. And they were all national interest type items that we would want to be making sure are considered going forward. And it's a recent history. And if you look at the JEDA communique that came out, there were very specific things that were talked about. Clearly, if you remember, the discussion was, I'm not going there to talk about oil, although of course they did. And energy security was important. But we talked about consulting regularly on this, and maybe this hasn't gone the way we want it. But we did finalize a partnership on clean energy, a partnership on global infrastructure that came out as a result of the G7. Like I said, these long-term things we've been working with Saudi that has to do with digital connectivity and supply chain. In terms of defense, I mentioned deterring Iran, but we want free flow of commerce in the region. I'll put my Navy hat on for a minute here and talk about free flow of commerce through not just the Straits of Hormuz, but the Bab el-Mandeb Strait up to the Suez. And we saw what happened to the global supply chain when a ship just gets sideways for a minute in one of those critical straits. And we're still feeling tremendous ramifications from the supply chain impacts of that. So that communique actually called out specifically Task Force 150, and that Saudi Arabia is leading that task force for enhancing free flow of commerce. And also it talked about Task Force 153, which is in the Red Sea, and how important that is right now, and those waters are to keep things flowing, especially with the war in Yemen. And it talked about Task Force 59, which is Saudi Arabia again participating with this, AI and maritime security in the region with cutting edge technology that other nations can play in. So that's on the defense side. On the communication side, think of, we all know what we felt when we saw Huawei get leverage in the Middle East. Well, this communique talked about partnering with Saudi Arabia on 6G and what's next, and is this a chance to displace Huawei, which is what we would want in the region. The MOU that we signed on cybersecurity with them, the agreements we signed related to space and the future development of space. There was continued agreement for the truce in Yemen. We'll see how that plays out over time. But also Israel, Syria, Palestine were discussed. The war in Ukraine was discussed. And as Joanne rightly mentioned, Saudi did vote in the UN to condemn what happened there. And then maybe near and dear to my heart, most importantly, they committed to their continual support of countering terrorism, especially ISIS. They were one of the first and founders of the coalition to defeat ISIS way back in 2014. But they also happen to host the Terrorist Finance Targeting Center in their own country, which is doing really good work in that regard. And what we have to look at as we go forward is what do we lose in those agenda items when we're talking about separating from Saudi or in any way making reducing our partnership with them and what that means. So I won't talk a lot about oil. I think the jury's out on how much this really will have a direct impact. Clearly, it'll have impact. The question is, there's a lot of intertwined things related to oil, and how this plays out in the long run has to do a lot about with what we do also, and what the European nations do. As you know, there's caps coming, and there's also talks about other things that can be done. And so what happens there is really undetermined to me. I'm not really sure how that's going to play out. Maybe if we look at it, we have the G7 oil price cap, but we have the embargo on seaborne delivery of Russia crude that goes into effect on December 5th. And all of these are going to play. So one thing to think about is, if this had happened 2 months from now, how would we be reacting? That puts in context my question about long-term and short-term. And then I want to kind of end with this, Bilal, and talk a little bit about foreign military sales, because we often use that, and you've seen Senator Mendez and others talk about, legislation where we can curtail that. And we've used that before. Melissa Horvath, our own MEI scholar and fellow, has talked about it's not uncommon for us to use FMF in a way as a leverage and an instrument to influence partners. From my operational view, where I've watched this directly on many occasions, the most recent when I went to Bahrain right after we had curtailed our FMS sales to them and then reinstated it, I rarely see it achieve an objective that we would want when we put it in place. In other words, it generally creates frustration and often supports the narrative that the U.S. isn't a reliable partner And in this case, in the region, maybe the feeling of abandonment gets cemented even more. That's clear in the region. Is the U.S. going to continue to want to influence there? Are we reliable? So I think going forward, the price of suspending security cooperation, we should look at it really carefully. Do we want to lose the influence that we have in the region? Do we want to lose our ability to defend, which we have to do? Do we want to, we have our vital strategic interests that I mentioned in maintaining, and we want to maintain influence because it's a vital region of the world. And it's really important for us not to create opportunities for others to step in. I absolutely agree. Russia's capability to step in is diminished, but China's is not. And we do need to understand that Iran would see that as a tremendous victory if we would be curtailing our relationships with either Saudi or the UAE. And I don't see that as in our interest, but we can talk more later. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was terrific, all three of you. Very much appreciated that, enjoyed every moment. Bruce, you've served multiple presidents. You've been in the room. Heck, I remember when I got the call and you were asked to serve President Obama to do that strategic review of Afghanistan, Pakistan. So you know that the president now is considering reevaluating the relationship with Saudi Arabia, as Joanne was just mentioning. If you're in the room, what would you advise him to do?
Thank you, Bilal. As Joanne rightly pointed out, decision-making in that room in Washington involves factors that don't deal with the bilateral US-Saudi relationship. And one of the big factors in the Biden administration's determinations in the next week or so is the fact that their own support base on the Hill and in the Democratic Party has already made up its decision. As was noted, Senator Menendez from New Jersey has already said he will not support any additional arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he can personally make sure that there is never another arms sale to Saudi Arabia on his watch. He can simply fail to convene a meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then the arms sale just dies right out there. So the reality is for President Biden that his party has already constrained his options. It's inconceivable to me that a president would go forward in this atmosphere with a new arms deal with Saudi Arabia. It would just flop out completely. So the question is, what can he do to put his own stamp on the relationship with Saudi Arabia? There are a number of issues out there. One is a legal issue that is complicated, but I'll try to simplify it. There is a legal proceeding against Mohammed bin Salman by Mr. Khashoggi's fiancée. The Saudis are arguing that he cannot be sued in the United States because of sovereign immunity, and that having been made prime minister, he is now the sovereign, which, by the way, is complete hokum. He's prime minister for the meetings that don't matter. The Saudis specifically said that King Salman will be prime minister in any meeting that he chairs. Well, he chairs all the meetings that count. But leaving aside that somewhat important detail, the courts have asked the president, should sovereign immunity be applied to MBS? And it seems to me in this situation, Joe Biden now has a very simple option, and that is to say no, let him live in the world of being under trial. And while he's not going to obviously be put in jail while he lives in Saudi Arabia, effectively it means he can never come to the United States again. That's one small gesture. I think Biden's going to need to do something more than that. I think the pressure to not only stop arms sales, but to restrict other parts of the military-to-military relationship will be enormous. There has been long push in the Hill by Senators Chris Murphy and others to cut off spare parts to the Saudis. The Saudis had 75% of their military equipment from the United States. Without American spare parts, that equipment won't work. And you can't take a Russian radar system and put it on an American jet. You can, if you want to have a one-way flight. You can't put Chinese munitions on American jets. So I think there's going to be enormous pressure on the president. Now, he has to balance against that the importance of Saudi Arabia, which all three of us have emphasized in our conversations. This is a country that has mattered a lot to the United States for the past 75 years. Managing the future of that is going to be very, very tricky, particularly given the personality of the Crown Prince. Let me say one last thing. You often hear people say, well, he's only 37. We're going to have to deal with him for the next 50 years. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. MBS has made a lot of enemies in Saudi Arabia. The Nayef wing of the family, for example. All those people who were rounded up at the Ritz-Carlton and shaken down for funds. Those people have no interest in this guy ruling the kingdom for the next 50 years and shaking them down periodically every couple of years. For the last 7 years, he's had the legitimacy of being the king's son. And the king, no one argues, is illegitimate. He is the 25th son of Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He is fully legitimate in that role. Saudi Arabia was always going to have a problem of legitimacy when we passed from the sons of Ibn Saud to the grandsons and the great-grandsons. That problem will come to a head when King Salman passes away. What happens next, I don't think, is a foregone conclusion. Last thing I would say on that point is, and MBS knows it himself, which is why he lives in a world of high security, rarely being seen in public, spending a lot of time in remote parts of the kingdom where the chance of an assassination attempt are limited because there's very limited opportunity to get to him. This is a country whose future is very much up in doubt today, I would say more than at any time. And the Saudis have a history of removing people from the kingship when they prove to be incompetent. Abdulaziz's immediate successor, King Saud, it took almost a decade, but King Faisal finally got him out of the picture, and he spent the rest of his life in exile. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. Joanne, I think it's the same question. What do you think we should do moving forward?
Well, I find it very interesting that it can seem that there is within the United States domestic political arena, that there is bipartisan support for some significant policy shift or policy action critical of Saudi Arabia. But it's worth noting that the two main parties in the United States have very, very different reasons for highlighting the issue right now. The GOP wants to demonstrate that it proves that President Biden is all bad things. You know, I've gone through the range of news sources over the last few days, and it's very interesting how quickly that discussion shifts from what is happening in Saudi Arabia to purely personal comments on Biden. The voices from the Democratic Party tend to relate more to the kinds of long-term concerns that we have had with Saudi policy, domestically and internationally, criticisms of MBS and his role within the country. So talking about, that there is broad bipartisan support for anything on this, I think misses the complexity of that issue. Bruce pointed out the Saudi successful move to remove President Saud when he was clearly not competent at that point, and that reflects the functioning and the role of the Saudi royal family at that time. I think it is worth looking at whether the royal family would be able to do that now, or would be able to do it now in such a relatively calm and controlled way. So we can't assume that it would be an easy shift. Shifting gears a little bit, Kid talked about weapons and arms sales and counterterrorism. And I think these are important issues, and we really don't have the time to go into all of the factors. You know, I have been in the meetings, and you mentioned Bahrain, and I have been in those discussions when there's a question of, but, you know, they're doing bad things. From the perspective of security cooperation, there's obviously an argument for reliability and continuity from the viewpoint of making money off arms sales. There's an equal argument. I think that one of the factors that is important, looking at it multilaterally, is that if we have in mind at all that we as the United States and NATO and other countries want to be able to cooperate on critical issues with the countries of the Gulf, we do want systems to be interoperable. And that's a factor we can't get away from, as much as I may be critical of our overemphasis on arms sales as the determining factor in a relationship. Last point on counterterrorism. Clearly, Saudi Arabia has suffered from attacks, ironically, from some of the same groups that other people will accuse them of supporting. However, Saudi Arabia and other countries have used our insistence that they have strong counterterrorism laws to exercise repression against political opposition within their own countries. And, you know, Saudi Arabia's sort of joint cause with Egypt's Sisi against the Muslim Brotherhood is an example of the very, very murky area that can move into. So in terms of the United States, I'm loath to offer a direct policy recommendation other than let's be very, very careful on considering the factors that are going to apply and how we are able to discuss any changes domestically in the United States, with Saudi Arabia, and with other allies.
Perfect. Thank you, Joanne. Kid, before I go to you, this is an interesting note from our friend from the Congressional Research Service, Christopher Blanchard. I think it relates to what Bruce was talking about as far as the constraining options of the president on the issue of foreign military sales. So he says, unless Congress proactively votes on a veto-proof basis to block or otherwise condition a formally proposed arms sale to include sales of parts and service, the president may proceed. The 2019 Trump administration emergency arms sales proceeded over congressional opposition. And this is obviously from someone who does this on a daily basis. Kid, reevaluating the relationship. What do you think we should do?
Yeah, thanks, Bilal. I think we should be careful not to do it in a bilateral view only. So I'm completely aligned with some of what the other speakers have said, that if we're not carefully looking at this through the one long lens and two broader lens of how it impacts not just the region, but globally, fundamentally, we do have a changed world, right? And this is a piece of it, but we'll talk, if we look more broadly, you know, the wars return to the European continent. China is in the Middle East, right? Russia is in the Middle East and has operating bases there. That used to be a condition, actually, what was one of our red lines back in the day. So fundamentally, we have a changed world more broadly, and it is interconnected. It's interconnected by the supply chain. And we know that one of the keys to supply chain being assured is one, free flow of commerce, but then two, stability, right, in whatever region that exists. So we should be looking clearly at what creates the most stability. And we should be very careful about bifurcating the GCC, which is already very bifurcated, right? The GCC is not an entity in and of itself. Joanne's lived this on the ground and many times. We put them together as an entity, and they couldn't be more different as individual nations with different views. But we still work really hard to pull them together for common causes and common good, whether that common good be free flow of commerce, or that common good be a united front against Iran, or in this case, what are we doing relative to Ukraine and oil and such? I would want to make sure that in the future, we're going to look at this more broadly. Remember, those nations we're talking about, Saudi Arabia has been directly attacked. You can argue about the war in Yemen, but that attack was more related to Iran than Yemen. And I'm talking about the Aramco attack. And the U.S. didn't do a whole lot. The UAE was attacked, again, from Yemen, but we know that the roots of all that came from Iran's capabilities and what Iran put there, and we did very little there. And they are now trying to sort out as when we say reliable partner, we're talking about being there in their time of need. We are an amazing reliable partner for the Ukraine right now in terms of the billions of dollars we're spending and what we're doing. I'd argue that we have a lot at stake also in the Middle East, and we want to make sure that our national interests aren't jeopardized by whatever steps that we take going forward. And if we look at it through that lens that includes the things that Joanne talked about, the interconnectedness, we have to look at it through the lens that MBZ and MBS have a relationship. And they do see some of this in the same way. And I know for a fact that, they'd rather be with the United States than with Russia or China. I absolutely know that. As hard as we are to deal with, I know that. I also know that we're a big enough nation with smart enough people to look at this more broadly. We can take a step back from what's happening in midterm elections and political parties and actually make decisions that are based in our national interests when we put our best minds to it and take a little bit of a breath here. That's my advice going forward, Bilal. It's not anything more than that. It's just look at this as broadly as we can.
Copy. Thank you, Kid. There are a lot of questions, and it's my challenge to try to pick some that I feel are more pertinent than others. Joanne, this one I think is for you because you've mentioned it before. And it has to do with the economic basis of the decision to cut oil production. And at the end of the day, you said, if I remember correctly, it's plausible that this was really driven in large part by economic considerations. So the question is, wasn't this the right decision by OPEC Plus?
Right decision is a complicated statement. I think that an argument can be made that, number one, Saudi Arabia and others wanted to increase the buffer that they have in their productive capacity, because when you're running too close to the edge, you really can't respond. You can't respond to a crisis. The need to maintain, from the point of view of an oil exporter, the need to maintain a consistent level of oil prices so that you are able to budget, which is not just a question of paying salaries, but it's a question of maintaining political stability, becomes very important. I struggle to see this being a direct benefit to Russia in economic terms, because their export is down. It's mainly going to China and India, and they're getting it at a discount. So seeing this as some major windfall for Russia in terms of its war in Ukraine, which I would be very much opposed to, I'm not sure you can make the economic argument. In terms of timing, you can argue whether it should have been done this way or not. that argument can be made. But I think Saudi Arabia can definitely make the argument that they have a domestic imperative to maintain a stable budgetary base.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Bruce, I think you can take the next question. This one is about MBS. Question that says, quote, MBS has terrible human rights policies, but he's very popular within his country. How do we square that? I think you started, addressing that before.
Well, first thing I would say is, how do we know he's popular? Saudi Arabia does not have polling. You do not have the freedom to write what you think or to say what you think. So yes, the right answer for any Saudi who's asked by a foreigner in Saudi Arabia, do you like MBS, is, of course I do, because I'd like to keep my head connected to the rest of my body. I'm not disputing that some of his policies have been very popular, allowing women to drive, although there remains significant restrictions on what women can do. Letting women drive was a popular move, allowing concerts and movie theaters. In other words, some social liberalization of Saudi Arabia was badly overdue. King Abdullah actually knew that and talked about it frequently. He didn't really do much about it, but he talked about it frequently. So in that sense, yes, he has a certain amount of popularity. But decision-making in Saudi Arabia is not a function of what the average Saudi in the street thinks. It's a function of what the royal family wants to do. And as we've noted before, under King Salman and MBS, the number of royal family members who are involved in decision-making has become much, much smaller. Many of those people nurse grudges against MBS. I mentioned the Nayef wing of the family. I think there's good reason to believe the Abdullah wing of the family feels the same way. And let me make one other point. The clerical establishment. Clerical establishment was crucially important to Faisal in getting rid of Saud back in the 1960s. It was the Wahhabi clerical establishment that issued more than one statement saying that Ibn Saud was not fit to rule. Well, the same things that have made MBS popular with the broader population, curtailing the rights of the religious police, letting women drive, all those things are not very popular in the clerical establishment. American diplomacy in Saudi Arabia has always been hampered by the fact that the clerical establishment basically won't talk to us. And the clerical establishment that matters the most is in Mecca, where we can't go talk to them. So there's powerful forces here at play. And as I said earlier, I think it's a mistake to assume that Saudi Arabia is going to go on autopilot and that we're going to see Mohammed bin Salman around for the next 50 years. One other thing I want to say, and that's about the previous question. Perception matters a lot. And the Saudis must have known that coming out with this decision at this time, a month before the midterms, was going to be very, very difficult for Joe Biden. You look at the headlines that he's gotten. Some of them are really quite devastating. If the Saudis didn't realize that this was going to be interpreted in the United States the way it is, then they need to get a new embassy. They need to stop listening to their lobbyists and start listening to what's going on in this country. Joe Biden cannot just afford to do nothing now. His base, Senator Menendez, Senator Murphy, Congressman Ro Khanna, want him to do something. And the minimum they want is no new arms sales. And he's going to have to do at least the minimum. And he's going to have to put his personal stamp on whatever he does. Does that mean the end of the relationship? No, I don't think it does. Because this relationship is not equal. The Saudis need us a lot more than we need them. And yes, they can go to the Russians. Yeah. The Russian army, the Russian Air Force. Yes, they have a base in Syria. Yeah. Boy, I would really like to know that Bashar Assad was my number one ally in the Middle East. They're one of 5 countries that consistently votes for Russia on Ukraine matters. 0 plus 0 is still 0. And they have the Chinese. Are the Chinese really going to defend them against Iran? I don't think so. I don't think that that's much of an alternative. In terms of security protection, they need us much more than we need them. That isn't to say that we don't need them. It isn't to say that it isn't very helpful to American diplomacy to have the Saudis working with us. I know that for a fact from 8 years in the White House. It's much easier to get something done in the Middle East if the Saudis are on your side pushing for it. But at the end of the day, this relationship is not one of equals.
Right.
And Joe Biden should keep that in mind as he goes forward in the days ahead.
Copy. Thank you, Bruce. I've got 4 minutes and I want to do 3 things. One, Joanne, I know you got a 2-finger real quick, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to speak, but then I want to ask a question to Kid, and then I want to thank all 3 of you. So 2-finger, Joanne, on what Bruce was talking about.
One thing that we haven't mentioned is that Saudi Arabia has always struggled with the fact that the royal family doesn't have the lineage from the prophet to fall back on for legitimacy. Their legitimacy has been their religious role, and that's been the link with al-Sheikh. MBS has stepped away from that and is, I think, putting more of his eggs in the basket of personal popularity because he is doing these things for the youthful part of the population. That does mean that he has much less flexibility in terms of what he does. If he loses that, he has lost the other thing that they have traditionally relied on. That's all.
Thank you, Joanne. Kid, you got 2 minutes. I know recently you were in Israel, so I'm going to throw this question at you. Given the sharp deterioration in U.S.-Saudi relations, do you expect a Saudi gesture to Israel to mitigate tensions?
Oh, that's a great question.
Right.
There's a lot of complexities with Saudi and Israel that will take more than a couple minutes to talk about. But the one thing that has been positive about Israel's involvement at the Abraham Accords in the Middle East has been it's been a catalyst for more work amongst those Gulf countries, and that's been a positive. And Saudi included in that, whether or not they overtly signed the Abraham Accords, we are seeing cooperation at I would call it unprecedented level, and it's not just across the military domain; it's across several domains, which is something that will only go well fast if the U.S. stays involved in a leadership role. And I see that as a win because we can, in a leadership role, not have to invest as much. And so that has been a positive. So that's my input on Israel in a 30-second soundbite, since I know you're tight.
Okay. Thank you, Kid. I got 1 more minute, and then I want to thank all 3 of you for, this is precisely why I invited all 3 of you, because this was really balanced. There was a lot of seriousness, a lot of maturity, a lot of depth in this conversation. Bruce, it's a pleasure to see you again. Kid, thank you very much for doing this. And Joanne, once again, welcome to the team. Everybody else, thank you for joining. We're going to upload this on the website, also on YouTube. So if you didn't have a chance to see it, you could see it whenever you want at some point later. Goodbye.